Alright, guys, today we're going to get started on the federal bureaucracy within the executive branch. I gotta say, as far as like this whole process we've been going through, we have been making some serious moves, guys. Like, the gains have never been more real. And if we're looking at this whole experience in short summary, no, this isn't a replacement to being actually in the classroom where I could see you guys and make fun of you and all this different stuff, but there's definitely some intelligent aspects of doing education this way, but I'll let you be the judge of that. For today, though, we're talking about bureaucracy. Now, what is bureaucracy? Pretty much a short summary definition of it. It's a large, complex administration which handles the everyday business of an organization. If you take that word bureaucracy, and if you add the word federal to it, you get what? You simply get federal bureaucracy. You just put one word in front of the other. So the federal bureaucracy simply is just the complex structure of how the executive branch is organized. And in short summary, it's organized into 15 different departments as well as various agencies. More on that later. Now, this hasn't always been the case throughout our nation's history. When we started off as a nation, like going back to Jefferson's presidency, there was roughly only 2,100 people working in the executive branch. Today, there's over 4 million people working in the executive branch. But I thought the executive branch was all about the president, Mr. Shoens. Sure, but the job of the executive branch ultimately is to enforce the law. Do you think the President of the United States is capable of doing this alone? Moving on. The President's administration. Now, an administration is just the management of an office, business, or an organization, and thusly you have the President's administration. We call it like the Trump administration, the Obama administration, and so forth. The President needs his administration to help him carry out what he needs to do in the executive branch. And that also translates to the President's cabinet. The cabinet is simply the principal appointed officers of the departments of the executive branch. The cabinet meets weekly to advise the president of what's going down in our nation and what needs to be addressed. And I'm sure they're meeting hourly, if not every minute, with the situation we're dealing with right now in our nation. But what's the difference between bureaucracy and like an administration? Well, here it is in short summary. A bureaucracy refers to everybody in the executive branch and how it's organized. The people who are appointed by the president and the people who are not. The administration purely refers to the people the president brings in once they're elected. So those department heads, like the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, all those positions are picked by the president. That's part of his administration. The bureaucracy is everybody, including the people the president does not pick. I'll give you an example being the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture has roughly 105,000 employees in it. When a new president comes into town, there isn't suddenly 105,000 people who are suddenly out of a job. That's the bureaucracy part. The one job that does change is the head of that department, with the Secretary of Agriculture in this case. With every new president, they come in and choose the heads of these departments, but the people who work there year round, regardless of which administration it is, they keep their job as long as they're doing their job. These are the current people in our current president's cabinet. I'm not going to really go over any of them right now, but I thought you would like to see them. They're all the heads of all the executive departments within the executive branch, all 15 of them. And here's the last four. If you're wondering why that guy is in yellow, it's because there's a vacancy in the Department of Homeland Security, and he's just kind of filling in on a temporary basis. Sorry, Chad. The whole role of the White House in all this is think of it kind of like a nerve center for the executive branch, kind of like MI6 for James Pond or something like that. The heads of the department will go and do whatever they specialize in, but they ultimately report to the President of the United States, who dishes out the resources and all that different stuff. Now, when it comes to the executive branch, nearly 2/3 of all the employment is going to be within these departments. The other third we'll get into later. There are 15 total departments within the executive branch. That number isn't set in stone. They could add more if they feel that they need more. But let's go back to the president's cabinet. Now, the president chooses who's the heads of all these departments once they win election. Now, to keep checks and balances okay, the Senate has to confirm those appointments because, again, those are very prominent positions. But why does the president get to choose them? I mean, we vote for the president. Shouldn't we vote for secretaries of defenses and agriculture and stuff as well? Well, being the head of the executive branch, it makes a whole lot of sense that you're going to want to pick the people you work with. That way, you have people with like minded goals, beliefs, agendas, and so forth. And you don't have to spend 4 years in the White House hating someone like Adams and Jefferson. And that's called the spoils system. And Andrew Jackson was the one who started this whole thing. Prior to Andrew Jackson, there really wasn't a whole lot of change within the president's cabinet. If you did such a good job in the previous presidency, you might as well stay in that position. That's why people like Madison was Secretary of State for 3 different presidents. It's However, Andrew Jackson changed that. Basically, when he got into Washington D.C., he saw the people in his cabinet and was just like, "I don't want any of you guys in my cabinet. You're all fired. I want to pick my guys to do the job." That's known as the spoils system. That's why Andrew Jackson is famous for the saying, "To the victor goes the spoils." Now, problem with this, at least at the beginning, was that included everybody. So, all the people in the executive branch, including the people who work within those departments, not just the department heads, which led to a lot of people and a lot of chaos and turmoil when it came to jobs in the executive branch. I mean, imagine it today. Imagine if a new president comes into town for 4 years and 4 million people are suddenly out of their job. That would be quite shocking. Now, fortunately slash unfortunately, Congress passed a bill that became law known as the Pendleton Act, which changed that. Basically said that there's certain positions that the president can appoint, such as the heads of those departments, but other government positions should be based on merit. If you are a custodian in the Department of Defense and you do a great job at cleaning up people's mess, then you should continue being a custodian in the Department of Defense, regardless if there's a new president in town. Now, you might have noticed there it says fortunately slash unfortunately. Why unfortunately? Well, it took a president dying in order for the Pendleton Act to be passed. If you're curious about that story, look it up. Now, the first 4 executive departments. So, at the beginning, we didn't have all 15 because there would be no need for something like a Department of Transportation when transportation equaled horses back then. But the Constitution says very little on the creation of various departments in general. Why do you think the Constitution doesn't say anything like, hey, you must have a Secretary of State or some sorts? It doesn't need to. That's what the Elastic Clause is all about. As time changes, we're flexible. When you get to the point where you need a Department of Transportation, make it. What the Elastic Clause is all about. Now, the first 4 executive departments are these 4. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about these 4. The other ones we won't really spend a whole lot of time on. We got the Department of Defense, we got the Department of Justice, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of State. It should be noted that the Department of Defense was actually called the Department of War back then. And that's the one we're going to talk about today, the Department of Defense. You might have seen this building before, and if you went to DC last year, then I know you at least went to the Pentagon City Mall, so there's that. The Department of Defense, they meet in the Pentagon, and they were created to unify all our armed forces. Being that the president is the commander in chief, the highest ranking military officer in our country, obviously he's going to want a place to meet and collaborate and game plan with his military. Now, the person in charge of that Department of Defense is known as the Secretary of Defense, and he basically has 2 jobs. One, be the advisor to the president when it comes to defense policy and making out foreign policy in the form of like military actions, and also operate the head of the Defense Department, meaning he's the one in charge of that Pentagon. Now, there's 5 branches in the military in total. You got the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard. If you've been at Marine long enough, you probably know a song to go with those 5. But I know at least one person is thinking, what about Space Force? It actually is a thing. Our sixth branch of the military, but it's kind of a little baby right now, and we're trying to figure out things. But at least as of now, it is a thing. But I'm not going to put it in the same conversation as the other five who have been around much longer. Now, moving on, within that Defense Department, you have something known as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are basically senior advisors in the Department of Defense who help advise the Secretary of Defense so he can ultimately advise the President. And you have representation from pretty much all the branches of the military in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the President does choose the people within the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, you might have looked at that list and was like, hang on, Mr. Shoens, I think there's a branch of military missing there. And you're right, Coast Guard is missing because Coast Guard is actually part of the Department of Homeland Security. That'll be all for today. There's an assessment that you can get started on today, but you'll need the notes for tomorrow to complete it. I just want to say to you guys to hang in there and don't forget you're awesome.